Somewhere between midnight and silence, loyalty still chooses to stand guard. The words echoed through the empty stretch of riverbank like a warning the night itself refused to explain. It was 12:07 a.m. when Sergeant Ethan Walker of the United States Marine Corps slowed his vehicle along the edge of the Millstone River, headlights cutting through a thin veil of mist that hovered just above the water like a breath held too long. The temperature outside hovered around 41 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sting exposed skin, but not enough to freeze the slow-moving current that reflected fractured pieces of moonlight. Ethan had been on routine perimeter patrol for nearly 3 hours, his mind locked into the quiet discipline of repetition, the kind that leaves no room for distraction, only awareness. That was until he saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow that didn't belong to the trees. Then it moved, subtly, deliberately, as if the darkness itself had decided to take shape and wait. A German shepherd stood on the narrow strip of gravel between the river and the trail, completely still, facing the water. Its posture was rigid but not aggressive, its ears angled forward with a focus so intense it felt unnatural. Ethan slowed the vehicle further and eventually came to a stop roughly 30 feet away, letting the engine idle as he studied the scene. The dog did not react. No bark, no retreat, only stillness, as if it had been placed there with purpose rather than instinct. Ethan stepped out of the truck, boots pressing into damp gravel that shifted slightly under his weight. The air carried the scent of wet stone, pine sap, and cold water moving over rock. He adjusted the strap on his tactical vest out of habit rather than necessity and took a cautious step forward. "Hey there," he called softly, his voice steady but low, the way one speaks to something fragile in the dark. Still nothing. The dog remained focused on the river, unmoving, as though listening to something beneath the surface that no human ear could detect. Its coat was sable with streaks of darker black along the spine, slightly damp as if it had been standing there for some time. Ethan noticed its stance wasn't random. It was protective, deliberate, positioned between the water and something unseen behind it. "You lost?" he asked again, taking another step closer, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. The dog finally shifted, just enough to acknowledge him, turning its head slightly, but not breaking its position. In the faint glow of the moonlight, Ethan could see its eyes, amber and steady, holding a kind of alertness that didn't match a stray animal. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was watchfulness, the kind that comes from waiting. Something about that look tightened in his chest in a way he didn't immediately understand. Ethan had served long enough to recognize patterns in behavior, in posture, in survival instinct. But this was different. This wasn't survival. This was vigilance. He stepped closer, now within about 15 feet, and noticed something partially buried in the wet sand near the dog's front paws. A collar, old and worn, its metal tag dulled by time and moisture. He crouched slightly, careful not to rush, and squinted to read the faint engraving. The name was barely visible, but it was there, Daniel R. The moment he processed it, something shifted in the air. Not physically, but emotionally, like the weight of the night had changed direction. Ethan looked back at the dog. "Daniel," he repeated quietly, almost to himself, as if testing the name against reality. The German shepherd lowered its head just slightly, not in submission, but in something closer to recognition of memory rather than presence. It did not move toward him. It did not leave the river's edge. Instead, it remained anchored to that exact spot, as if the boundary between land and water held answers it refused to abandon. Ethan's training told him to assess, report, and proceed with caution, but something deeper, something human, kept him there. The river flowed steadily beside them, indifferent and constant, carrying reflections of a sky that would never explain what had happened before this moment. And as Ethan stood there in the cold stillness of midnight, he realized this wasn't a dog that had wandered. This was a dog that was waiting, not for help, but for something the world might have already taken away. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, as if the river itself was holding its breath in agreement with something unspoken. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the German shepherd that had not moved an inch since he first arrived. The animal's posture had not changed, yet something about its presence now felt even more deliberate, as if Ethan's arrival had been anticipated rather than discovered. He took a slow step closer, stopping roughly 10 feet away, and lowered his voice again, careful not to disturb whatever fragile balance existed in that space. "Easy now. I am not here to take anything from you," he said calmly, his tone measured and steady in the way Marines are trained to speak when uncertainty replaces orders. The dog finally shifted its head, just slightly, acknowledging him without surrendering its position. Its amber eyes reflected the faint shimmer of the river, and in that reflection Ethan thought he saw something deeper than alertness. It looked like persistence, like a promise that refused to dissolve even under time or absence. He let his hand fall slowly to his side, choosing not to reach out, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment that could be forced. Instead, he turned his attention back toward the ground near the river's edge. The collar he had noticed earlier was now more visible, partially uncovered as the wind shifted the damp sand around it. He crouched again, this time closer, and carefully lifted it with 2 fingers. The leather was worn, softened by water and time, but still intact enough to hold its shape. The engraved tag caught the faint light, and Ethan read it again, slower this time, as if confirming what he already feared he understood. Daniel R. The name lingered in the air between him and the dog, forming an invisible bridge that explained nothing but meant everything. Ethan stood slowly, holding the collar in his hand, and looked at the river as if expecting it to answer questions it had never been asked before. "You have been here all night," he said quietly, more to himself than to the animal. The German shepherd remained still, but its ears shifted slightly at his voice, reacting not to command but to recognition. Ethan glanced downstream, scanning the dark surface of the water with renewed attention. The current was steady, about 3 to 4 feet per second, carrying small fragments of leaves and debris that glimmered briefly before disappearing into darkness. The riverbank itself showed subtle irregularities now that he was looking more carefully. A disturbed patch of gravel near the slope. A faint trail where wet fur had likely dragged against the ground. Nothing conclusive, but enough to suggest that something had happened here before he arrived. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of uncertainty settle deeper. His training told him to radio in a report, to secure the area, to treat it as an unresolved incident until verified otherwise. But standing there in the cold, with a dog that refused to leave a single point along the river, he also understood something else. This was not a search driven by procedure. It was a search driven by loyalty that had outlived clarity. The German shepherd finally took a step, but not toward him. It moved closer to the water's edge, then paused again, lowering its head slightly, as if listening to something beneath the surface. Ethan followed its gaze, kneeling slowly now, his boots pressing into the damp earth. The river reflected his silhouette in fragments, broken by ripples that distorted everything into shifting shapes. He studied the water carefully, scanning for movement, for anything that would justify the dog's unwavering vigil. There was none, only the steady flow of time passing through an indifferent current. Yet the dog did not waver. It remained locked in place, its entire posture oriented toward that exact point in the river, as if the answer was not something to be found, but something to be returned. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the collar. He felt a quiet heaviness in his chest, not fear, but recognition of something deeply human reflected through an animal that refused to let go. He looked back at the dog and spoke again, softer this time. "Whoever Daniel R. is, you are still looking for. Him, aren't you?" The German shepherd did not respond with sound or movement. It simply continued to watch the water, as if the question itself had already been answered long ago, and all that remained was the waiting. The river had begun to feel less like water and more like a memory that refused to settle, repeating itself in slow motion under the pale wash of moonlight. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained near the edge of the bank, still holding the worn collar in his hand, its leather softened by years of weather and silence. Behind him, the German shepherd had not moved from its fixed position, its body angled toward the river as if time itself was anchored beneath the surface. Ethan finally rose to his feet, exhaling slowly, his breath visible in the cold air that hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. He turned slightly, glancing between the dog and the water, and spoke in a lower tone, not expecting a response, but needing to voice the thought forming in his mind. You have been guarding this place like it is the only thing left in the world that matters, he said quietly. The dog's ears flicked at his voice, but its gaze did not break from the river. Ethan stepped back a few feet, scanning the shoreline more deliberately now, allowing his training to take over where instinct had already begun to pull him. The terrain here was uneven, a mixture of damp gravel, river grass, and scattered stones worn smooth by constant flow. About 15 yards downstream, he noticed a subtle disruption in the natural pattern of the bank, a section where the grass bent inward rather than outward, as if something had once passed through and never returned the same way. He moved toward it slowly, careful not to disturb the ground more than necessary. The German shepherd followed only with its eyes, remaining planted like a sentinel, refusing relief. When Ethan reached the disturbed patch, he crouched again, using the small tactical flashlight clipped to his vest. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, revealing faint impressions in the wet soil. They were not recent, but they were not ancient either, softened by time but still readable enough to suggest urgency in their creation. He traced the edge of the indentation with a gloved hand, then paused when he noticed something partially embedded in the mud. A second object, smaller than the collar, almost completely obscured. He carefully brushed it free. It was a military identification tag, dulled and scratched, but still legible enough to confirm a name that matched the collar. Daniel R. Ethan sat back slightly, letting the information settle without forcing interpretation. The river continued its steady flow beside him, indifferent to discovery or meaning. He looked back at the dog again. Its posture had not changed, but now there was something different in the way it held itself, a subtle tension easing rather than tightening, as if it had sensed that the truth was no longer hidden in uncertainty, but present in recognition. Ethan stood slowly, holding both the collar and the identification tag in his hand. For a long moment, he said nothing, only listening to the water and the wind moving through the trees above the riverbank. Then, quietly, he spoke again. "You did not leave," he said. "You stayed right here." The German shepherd finally shifted, turning its head slightly toward him for the first time since his arrival. Its amber eyes met his, steady and unbroken, and in that brief exchange there was no confusion, only acknowledgement. Ethan felt something settle in his chest, not relief, not resolution, but understanding shaped by loyalty that did not require explanation. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, placing the identification tag carefully into his palm and holding it still for a moment. The night around them remained unchanged, the river still moving, the wind still cold, the sky still vast and indifferent. Yet within that stillness, something had quietly completed itself. The waiting had not been empty after all. It had simply been patient beyond the limits of time. The night seemed to grow quieter after the moment of recognition, as if the river itself had exhaled something it had been holding for far too long. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained kneeling for several seconds, his gloved hand still resting near the damp soil where the identification tag had been uncovered. The German shepherd stood only a few yards away now, no longer rigid with tension, but not fully relaxed either, as if uncertain whether the truth it had guarded for so long had finally been accepted or simply witnessed. Ethan slowly rose to his feet, placing both the collar and the tag carefully into an inner pocket of his tactical vest, securing them with deliberate precision. His movements were steady, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, something quieter, heavier, like understanding replacing uncertainty. He looked at the dog again and spoke softly, his voice carrying through the cold air that hovered just above the riverbank. "I do not know how long you have been waiting here, but I think you already knew the answer before I arrived." The German shepherd finally took a slow step forward, not toward the water this time, but toward Ethan. It stopped about 5 feet away, hesitating for only a moment before lowering its head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. Ethan extended his hand slowly, palm open, giving the animal full control over the moment. The dog approached cautiously, closing the distance in small measured steps, until its nose lightly touched his glove. That brief contact carried more weight than words could define, a transfer of recognition rather than introduction. Ethan exhaled slowly and nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "You are not alone anymore," he said quietly. Behind them, the river continued its steady movement, unchanged by discovery or resolution, but the atmosphere around the bank had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Ethan stepped back slightly and scanned the area once more, this time not for clues, but for closure. The faint impressions in the soil, the worn grass, the disturbed gravel near the edge, all of it now formed a narrative that did not need further investigation to be understood. He raised his radio briefly, pausing before speaking, as if weighing the responsibility of what came next. "This is Sergeant Walker," he said calmly, requesting a non-urgent retrieval and identification confirmation at Millstone River, North Bank. His voice remained professional, but there was a subtle softness beneath it, the kind that comes when duty and humanity briefly overlap without conflict. After lowering the radio, he turned his attention back to the German Shepherd. The animal was now sitting, its posture no longer fixed on the water, but no longer entirely free from it either. It remained close to the river's edge, as if unwilling to abandon the place entirely even now. Ethan crouched again, this time at a respectful distance, and studied the dog more carefully. The coat was slightly damp, not from rain, but from prolonged exposure to mist rising off the water. There were no visible signs of injury or distress, only exhaustion that came from something deeper than physical strain. "You did everything you could," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. The German Shepherd's ears twitched slightly, responding not to command but to tone. For a long moment, neither moved. The river flowed steadily beside them, carrying fragments of light across its surface like memories that refused to settle in one place. Ethan eventually stood again, adjusting the strap of his vest and looking once more at the dark water. Whatever answers had existed here were no longer hidden in mystery. They had already been spoken in the only language that mattered to the one who had waited. He glanced down at the dog one final time and gave a slight nod. "Let's go," he said softly. And for the first time since midnight, the German Shepherd turned fully away from the riverbank and followed. The walk away from the riverbank felt different now, as if the night itself had shifted its weight and no longer needed to hold on to what it had been protecting. Sergeant Ethan Walker moved slowly along the narrow trail that followed the edge of the Millstone River, his boots pressing into damp gravel that softened with every step. The German Shepherd walked beside him, no longer rigid or anchored to a single point in space, but still cautious, still aware, as though the habit of vigilance could not simply be released all at once. The distance between them was close enough for trust, but not yet close enough for certainty. Ethan kept his pace steady, allowing the silence to settle naturally rather than forcing conversation or control. The river remained to their right, flowing in a steady rhythm that seemed unchanged by anything that had just been uncovered. Mist rose gently from its surface, catching faint fragments of moonlight and scattering them into the air like broken reflections of something that once mattered differently. After several minutes of walking, Ethan finally spoke again, his voice low and even, shaped by calm rather than urgency. "You do not have to stay there anymore," he said. The German Shepherd did not respond immediately, but its ears shifted slightly, acknowledging the sound of his voice while continuing to walk and step beside him. Ethan glanced down at the animal, studying its posture more closely now that movement had replaced stillness. There was no collar visible on its neck beyond the worn one he had found earlier, and no additional identification markers. Yet everything about its behavior suggested familiarity with structure, with discipline, with waiting for instruction even in absence of command. They continued along the river for roughly 200 yards before the terrain began to open slightly into a wider clearing where the trail curved away from the water. Ethan slowed his pace and eventually stopped near a flat section of ground where a small wooden bench had been partially weathered by time and exposure. He sat down briefly, resting his forearms on his knees, and exhaled through his nose in a controlled breath that carried both fatigue and reflection. The German Shepherd stopped a few feet away, then slowly lowered itself into a seated position, facing him rather than the river for the first time since he had arrived. Ethan looked at it for a long moment before speaking again. "You stayed because you believed he would come back," he said quietly. The dog's head tilted slightly at the sound of the words, but there was no change in its position. Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging something that did not require confirmation. "Loyalty like that does not disappear easily," he added. A faint wind moved through the trees above them, causing the branches to shift and release soft sounds that filled the space between river and sky. Ethan reached slowly into his vest pocket and felt the weight of the items he had placed there earlier, the collar and identification tag, both now secured and no longer exposed to the cold air. He did not remove them, but the presence of them reminded him that this moment was not about discovery anymore. It was about closure. He leaned back slightly on the bench and looked toward the river one last time, allowing his thoughts to settle without forcing meaning onto them. The German shepherd remained still, watching him now rather than the water, as if following his attention rather than its own memory. Ethan finally stood again after a few moments, adjusting the strap across his shoulder and shifting his weight forward. "We will make sure everything is handled properly," he said, his tone steady and professional once more, but softened at the edges. The dog rose as well, mirroring his movement without hesitation. Together they began to walk away from the clearing, leaving the river behind them as the mist continued to drift across its surface, slowly erasing the marks of what had been revealed but not the understanding that had been formed. The return journey from the riverbank took on a quieter rhythm, as if the world had decided to lower its voice in respect for what had already been understood. Sergeant Ethan Walker moved along the dim trail leading away from the Millstone River, his boots compressing damp earth that held the memory of recent mist. The air was colder now, settling closer to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and the faint humidity that had hovered over the water earlier was gradually giving way to a drier night wind that moved through the trees in slow, uneven patterns. Beside him, the German shepherd walked with steady control, no longer fixed to a single point of waiting, yet still carrying the discipline of a creature that had spent too long guarding silence. Ethan occasionally glanced down at it, observing how its pace matched his without hesitation, how its head remained slightly lowered but no longer searching the river behind them. They reached the edge of the main service road roughly 10 minutes later, where Ethan's vehicle sat parked under a weak overhead lamp that flickered intermittently against the dark. He stopped beside the driver door but did not immediately open it. Instead, he looked toward the dog, studying it in a way that was less about assessment and more about acknowledgement. "You are going to ride with me," he said calmly, as if stating something already decided rather than offering instruction. The German shepherd paused for only a moment before stepping forward and standing beside the passenger side door. Ethan opened it slowly, ensuring there were no sudden movements, and the dog climbed into the seat with controlled precision, settling itself with its gaze forward rather than outward. The interior of the vehicle was quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of dashboard indicators and the faint reflection of passing light through the windshield. Ethan started the engine, and the low hum filled the space between them as they pulled away from the river road. As the vehicle moved along the darkened highway, Ethan kept his attention divided between the road ahead and the silent passenger beside him. The German shepherd did not rest fully, but it also did not remain rigid in alert posture. Instead, it sat in a state that suggested exhaustion balanced by acceptance, as if the act of moving forward itself had begun to replace the need to remain behind. Ethan drove with steady control, maintaining a speed just under 45 miles per hour as the road curved gently through sparse wooded stretches and occasional open fields. Streetlights became more frequent as they approached the outskirts of a small town located roughly 8 miles from the river. The sign marking the town limits came into view, reflecting the headlights briefly before they passed beneath it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands steady on the steering wheel, and spoke without turning his head. "We will make sure you are taken care of properly," he said, his voice even and composed. The German shepherd shifted slightly at the sound of his voice, but remained seated, looking forward through the windshield as if observing the road with him. A few minutes later, they arrived at a small veterinary and emergency animal care facility situated near the edge of the town's main road. The building was modest, with a single illuminated sign above the entrance and a softly lit parking area that cast long shadows across the asphalt. Ethan parked near the front and turned off the engine, allowing the sudden quiet to settle around them. For a moment, neither moved. The German shepherd remained seated, its gaze fixed forward, while Ethan looked at the building ahead, considering not just the immediate need, but the responsibility that had now quietly transferred into his care. He opened the passenger door and stepped out, then stood beside it for a moment before gesturing gently. "Come on," he said softly. The dog followed without hesitation, stepping down onto the pavement and standing beside him. Together they walked toward the entrance. The night air cooler here, the sound of distant traffic faint but present, marking the boundary between isolation and human presence. As they reached the door, Ethan paused briefly, his hand resting near the handle, and looked once more at the German Shepherd. The animal met his gaze directly now, no longer searching, no longer waiting, but present in a way that suggested something had shifted permanently within its understanding of the world. Ethan gave a small nod and opened the door, stepping inside with the dog following closely behind. The interior of the veterinary emergency clinic was warm in contrast to the cold night outside, filled with a steady hum of soft fluorescent lighting and the faint scent of antiseptic that clung to the air like a memory of care. Sergeant Ethan Walker stepped inside first, allowing the door to close slowly behind him so as not to startle the German Shepherd that followed closely at his side. The reception area was quiet at this hour, with only a single desk illuminated and a faint rustle of movement coming from deeper within the building. A nurse on duty looked up immediately, her expression shifting from routine alertness to quiet attention as she noticed the uniform and the dog beside him. "Good evening," she said calmly, stepping forward from behind the counter. Ethan gave a slight nod in return. "We found him near the Millstone River," he said evenly. "He has been there for an extended period of time. No signs of immediate injury, but he appears to have been guarding a location without moving for hours." The nurse's eyes moved to the German Shepherd, who stood still now in the center of the room, its posture composed but alert, as if even the unfamiliar environment required observation before acceptance. "We will take a look right away," she said gently, motioning toward the examination area. Ethan followed without hesitation, keeping a steady presence beside the dog as they moved through a narrow hallway lit by soft overhead lights. The room they entered was clean and minimal, designed for efficiency rather than comfort, with a stainless steel examination table in the center and diagnostic equipment arranged neatly along the walls. The German Shepherd paused at the threshold, looking inside before stepping forward with controlled calmness. There was no resistance, only assessment, as if it were determining whether this space could be trusted in the same way it had once trusted the riverbank. Ethan remained close but did not interfere, allowing the veterinary staff to approach slowly. A veterinarian entered moments later, a woman in her late 30s with a calm, practiced demeanor, her eyes immediately softening when she saw the dog. "He is in good condition physically from what I can see at a glance," she said after a brief visual inspection. "But there is clear exhaustion and possible dehydration." She spoke gently as she moved closer, kneeling slightly to reduce her height and avoid overwhelming the animal. The German Shepherd did not retreat. Instead, it watched her with quiet attention, its body still but not tense. Ethan stood a few feet away, observing without interrupting, his hands resting loosely at his sides. "He was at the riverbank for an unknown period of time," Ethan added. "He refused to leave the area until recently." The veterinarian nodded slowly, reaching for a scanning device. "We will check for a microchip first," she said. The machine emitted a soft electronic tone as she passed it near the dog's shoulder and neck area. For several seconds, there was only silence, the kind that carries expectation without urgency. Then a soft beep indicated a result. The veterinarian paused, adjusting her position slightly to confirm the reading. "There is a registration," she said quietly. Ethan's attention sharpened, though his expression remained controlled. The veterinarian turned the screen slightly so he could see. The information displayed a name, contact record, and classification that confirmed prior ownership and military association. Ethan read it once, then again, letting the details settle without reaction. The German Shepherd remained still during this moment, as if aware that something important was being acknowledged, but not fully understanding the human interpretation of it. The veterinarian spoke again in a lower voice. "It appears this animal was previously assigned to active service. The record shows a connection to a handler listed as Daniel R." Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a moment before returning to the dog. There was no surprise in his expression now, only confirmation of what the river had already suggested. The pieces aligned quietly, not through dramatic revelation, but through gradual recognition. He stepped slightly closer to the examination table, placing a steady hand near the edge but not touching the dog. "That explains it," he said softly. The German Shepherd finally looked at him directly, holding his gaze for several seconds without movement. There was no confusion in its eyes, only a calm presence that seemed to accept both the past and the present in the same breath. Ethan nodded once, as if answering a question that had not been spoken aloud. The veterinarian continued with her assessment, documenting the findings while maintaining a gentle approach, but Ethan remained focused on the dog. In that moment, the clinic around them felt quieter than before, as if the discovery had shifted the weight of the entire room into something more reflective. The German Shepherd stood calmly under the soft lighting, no longer a sentinel at a riverbank, but still carrying the same unwavering sense of purpose that had brought it here. The quiet inside the veterinary clinic seemed to deepen after the scan results were confirmed, as if the air itself had adjusted to the weight of recognition. Sergeant Ethan Walker remained standing near the examination table, his posture steady, but his attention fully fixed on the German Shepherd that now sat calmly under the soft fluorescent light. The veterinarian had stepped slightly aside, documenting the microchip data on a handheld device while maintaining a respectful distance, allowing the moment between man and animal to remain uninterrupted. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowered for a brief moment before returning to the dog. The name displayed in the records still lingered in his thoughts, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of what the river had already suggested in silence. The German Shepherd shifted slightly, its ears turning toward him as if sensing the change in his focus. Ethan spoke quietly, his voice calm and deliberate. "You were not lost," he said. "You were waiting." The dog did not respond with movement or sound, but its eyes remained steady, holding his gaze with a kind of quiet acceptance that felt less like observation and more like understanding. The veterinarian finished her notes and looked up gently. "We will need to notify the listed contact information," she said softly. "If there is a surviving handler or family connection, they will be informed." Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the procedure without interruption. The idea of contact carried its own weight, not as urgency, but as closure forming slowly in real time. He turned slightly toward the window of the clinic room, where the reflection of the night outside was faintly visible against the glass. The world beyond remained unchanged, streets quiet, distant headlights passing occasionally, life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. Yet inside this room, something had shifted into clarity that could not be reversed. The German Shepherd stood now, stepping down from the examination table at the veterinarian's gentle guidance. Its movements were controlled, measured, no longer hesitant, but no longer anchored either. Ethan instinctively stepped closer as it moved toward him, not to restrain, but to remain present. The dog stopped within arm's reach and looked up at him. For a moment, neither moved. The veterinarian observed quietly from a distance, her presence professional but unobtrusive, recognizing that what was unfolding was not medical anymore, but relational in a deeper sense. Ethan slowly extended his hand, palm open, allowing the dog to make the choice. The German Shepherd leaned forward and pressed its nose lightly against his glove. It was a simple contact, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened since midnight at the riverbank. Ethan closed his fingers slightly, not gripping, only acknowledging the connection. "You did not stop believing," he said softly. The dog remained still, breathing calm and even, as if the tension that had defined its waiting had finally dissolved into something quieter. The veterinarian cleared her throat gently, breaking only the technical silence of the room. "We will keep him under observation for the night," she said. "He is stable, but rest will be important after prolonged exposure outdoors." Ethan nodded again, but his attention did not shift. He watched as the German Shepherd was guided toward a nearby resting enclosure, a clean, padded space within the clinic designed for temporary recovery. The dog entered without resistance, turning once inside to look back at him before settling down slowly. Ethan remained where he was, watching through the open gate as the animal finally lowered itself into rest. The room felt still again, but no longer uncertain. There was no more searching in the dog's posture, no more fixation on distant water or unseen absence. The waiting had transitioned into release, not as forgetting, but as acceptance of what could no longer be changed. Ethan finally stepped back from the enclosure, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked once more at the veterinarian. "If there is any follow-up needed, I will remain available," he said calmly. She nodded in acknowledgement. As Ethan turned toward the exit of the clinic, he paused briefly at the doorway and glanced back one final time. The German Shepherd was resting quietly now, its breathing steady, its presence no longer defined by vigilance, but by something closer to peace. Ethan exhaled softly and stepped outside into the cold night air, leaving the warmth of the clinic behind as the world returned to its steady, uninterrupted flow. The cold air outside the veterinary clinic hit Sergeant Ethan Walker the moment the door closed behind him, carrying with it the quiet weight of everything that had just been understood without words. The night felt unchanged on the surface, with distant headlights moving along the road and the faint hum of a town that had not paused for anything that had occurred inside that small room. Yet for Ethan, something fundamental had shifted. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, his hands resting at his sides, his breath visible in the air that hovered around 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The German Shepherd was no longer at the riverbank, no longer standing guard over an unanswered absence. It was inside, resting under soft light, no longer waiting for a return that would not come in the way it had once been imagined. Ethan began walking slowly toward his vehicle, his boots making faint contact with the pavement in steady rhythm. Each step felt measured, not from urgency, but from reflection. He reached the driver door and paused, resting one hand on the frame as he looked briefly back toward the clinic building. Through the glass, he could see only faint movement of light and shadow, nothing distinct, yet enough to remind him that life continued in quiet processes even when understanding had already been reached. He opened the door and climbed into the vehicle, sitting still for a moment before starting the engine. The dashboard lights illuminated softly, casting a dim glow across his face as he adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. The road ahead was empty, stretching into darkness with only occasional reflections of streetlights marking direction. As he drove away from the clinic, the silence inside the vehicle felt different than before, no longer filled with unanswered questions, but with the presence of something settled. About 10 minutes into the drive, Ethan slowed slightly as he passed a narrow overlook near the outskirts of town, where the landscape opened briefly to reveal the distant line of the Millstone River far beyond the trees. He did not stop, but he allowed himself a moment to observe it through the windshield. The water was invisible from this distance, but he knew its path, its movement, its persistence. It no longer held mystery for him, only memory. He continued driving, eventually reaching a small base support facility located approximately 12 miles from the river. The gate was lightly staffed at this hour, and his identification was verified without delay. He parked in a designated area and stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. The air here was slightly warmer due to nearby structures, but still carried the chill of late night. Ethan stood beside his vehicle for a moment, looking across the quiet grounds where faint lights illuminated walkways and building edges. There was no urgency in his posture now, only continuity. He adjusted his vest slightly and began walking toward the administrative building, where reports would be filed and the incident near the river would be formally documented. As he moved through the entrance, the interior lighting shifted from cold exterior darkness to controlled brightness. A duty officer looked up from behind a desk, acknowledging his presence with a brief nod. Ethan approached calmly and placed the recovered items on the counter, the collar and identification tag now sealed in a protective sleeve provided earlier by the clinic. "Recovered at Millstone River, North Bank," he said evenly. The officer accepted the items and began processing the information without unnecessary delay. Ethan remained standing for a moment, then added quietly, "Animal was located, identified, and transferred to veterinary care." The officer nodded again, noting the update. Ethan stepped back slightly, his role in the immediate process now complete. He turned toward the exit but paused near the doorway, glancing once more toward the quiet interior of the building. There was no ceremony, no resolution marked by sound or attention, only the steady continuation of duty moving forward. He exited into the night again, where the air felt unchanged but no longer heavy. Above him, the sky remained dark and clear, with distant stars faintly visible beyond the glow of the town. Ethan walked toward his vehicle once more, his steps steady, his presence composed. Behind him, the facility continued its quiet operations without interruption. Ahead of him, the road stretched into open distance, no longer defined by what had been found, but by what had already been understood and released into memory.